Valuable tools to understand those complexities, how economic systems shape our social relationships, and how those relationships can change the system itself.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what do you think is their most important legacy? What makes their work worth studying and debating even now in the 21st century?
Well, for me, their biggest contribution is their critique of capitalism. They forced us to look at the problems with the system, to see the exploitation, the inequality, and the way it alienates people. And they gave us the language and ideas to understand and challenge those injustices.
Like they gave us a new way of seeing the world, a way to decode all those hidden power dynamics that affect our lives.
Exactly. And even if you don't agree with all of their solutions, their analysis of capitalism is incredibly relevant today. I mean, we're dealing with globalization, automation, climate change, and a huge gap between the rich and the poor. They were talking about these things way back when.
Yeah, it's crazy how much their work still resonates today.
It's because it gets to the heart of some of the most fundamental challenges we face. Their work is still inspiring movements for social justice, for economic equality, for a better world.
They show us that things don't have to stay the same, that another world is possible, that we can make a difference.
Absolutely. That's what makes their work so powerful.
Well, this has been mind-blowing. We've covered so much. The rise and fall of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, abolishing private property, their critique of the family, historical materialism, commodity fetishism, the Paris Commune, and how all these ideas actually played out in the real world.
It's been quite a journey through some of the most challenging ideas of the past 2 centuries.
I'm walking away with a whole new understanding of these issues and a renewed sense of wanting to do something about the problems we face today.
I'm glad to hear that. And as always, we encourage you to keep digging, to question everything, and to dive deeper into the sources and ideas we've talked about.
Right, because the point, as Marx and Engels said, is not just to understand the world, but to change it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Marx and Engels. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll unpack even more of their ideas and explore their relevance to the world we live in today.
Okay, so my brain is like officially overloaded with all these ideas.
Okay.
I think I need a real world example to help me understand this whole commodity fetishism thing. Yeah, I get that. Sometimes a good example is what you need. Let's talk about, I don't know, smartphones. Everyone's obsessed with them these days.
Yeah, totally guilty of that. But what do smartphones have to do with commodity fetishism?
Well, think about it. On the surface, your phone is just this cool piece of technology, right? We get all caught up in the features, the design, the brand name. But what we don't always see are the complex social relationships behind it.
You mean like the people who mine the materials, the factory workers who put it together, the whole global supply chain?
Exactly. And the environmental impact of all those processes. But commodity fetishism hides all that stuff. It makes us focus on the phone as a status symbol, a sign of how tech-savvy we are, without thinking about the real human and environmental costs.
So we're basically worshiping the object itself instead of the people who made it.
Yeah, that's the idea. And that's how commodity fetishism helps to keep the system going. Because it keeps us focused on buying more stuff, on constantly upgrading, on the endless pursuit of, well, things. And it distracts us from the underlying social relationships that are being exploited to produce all those things.
It's kind of a vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it makes it that much harder to break free.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how Marx and Engels critiqued capitalism. But what did they think the alternative should be? What was their vision for a communist society? Would everyone be wearing the same clothes, driving the same cars? Would we all just be robots?
Those are some common misconceptions. Marx and Engels weren't trying to create some cookie-cutter utopia. They saw communism as a historical process, a natural progression from capitalism.
So more like an evolution than a revolution.
Well, revolution is part of it, but yeah, they believe that the specific form communism would take would depend on the conditions of each society. There's no one-size-fits-all model.
So it's not about some top-down blueprint, but a bottom-up transformation.
Exactly. But they did lay out some general principles. Want to hear the highlights?
You bet. Lay 'em on me.
First off, they saw the abolition of private property. Remember, in that specific sense we talked about before, as essential. The means of production should be owned collectively.
So no more privately owned factories or corporations. Everything would belong to the people.
That's the idea. That way, wealth and resources could be distributed more fairly. They also thought that eventually, the state as we know it all, that bureaucracy and control would wither away, replaced by more democratic and decentralized forms of organization.
So less Big Brother, more power to the people.
Right. Now, I know some people find that idea scary, a world without a state. But Marx and Engels weren't anarchists.
Okay.
They believed that the state would still be important during the transition to communism, but only temporarily.
So the state would be like a tool to dismantle the old system and build something new.
That's a good way to put it. They thought it would be needed to stop counter-revolutionaries, to reorganize the economy, and to ensure a smooth transition. But eventually, they thought it would become obsolete as class divisions disappear and a truly egalitarian society emerges.
So it's like needing a crutch until you can walk on your own again.
Exactly. Now, it's important to remember that Marx and Engels didn't think this transition would be easy. They knew the ruling class would fight back, and they acknowledged that there would probably be conflict along the way, maybe even violence.
Oh, they weren't pacifists. They understood that sometimes to make real change, you have to fight for it.
They saw revolution as a necessary, maybe even inevitable part of the process, but they believed it would be a revolution driven by the people, not by some small group imposing its will on everyone else.
A true grassroots uprising, not a coup.
Exactly. Now let's talk about how Marx and Engels fit into the broader socialist and communist movements of their time. They weren't operating in a vacuum, right?
Right. In the manifesto, they spend quite a bit of time critiquing other socialist thinkers. It's like they're trying to set themselves apart to show that their brand of socialism, what they called scientific socialism, was the real deal.
That's a sharp observation. They were definitely engaged in a lively debate with other intellectuals and activists who were also trying to figure out how to fix the problems with capitalism. And they wanted to make it clear how their vision was different from what they saw as less realistic or maybe even misguided forms of socialism.
So what were some of their main criticisms? Who did they disagree with?
One group they called out were the reactionary socialists.
Reactionary. It sounds kind of harsh. Who are those guys?
Basically, they were thinkers who, while critical of capitalism in some ways, ultimately wanted to go back to the past. They longed for a simpler time before all the changes brought about by industrialization.
So, like those who think the good old days were actually good.
Yeah, kind of like that. And Marx and Engels argued that this kind of nostalgia was a step backward, a rejection of progress. They believed that capitalism, even with all its problems, had created conditions that were necessary for a more just and equitable society to emerge.
So no looking back, only forward, even if it's messy.
That was their stance. They saw the Industrial Revolution, the growth of cities, the rise of a global working class, all of that as essential for building a communist future. Trying to reverse those trends they thought was pointless and harmful.
Okay, so they weren't into nostalgia. Got it. Who else did they disagree with?
Another group they criticized were the petty bourgeois socialists. These were people who usually came from the artisan or small shopkeeper class.
Okay.
They tended to romanticize the pre-industrial way of life, when everyone was a craftsman, making things with their own hands.
Ah, so they were like, bring back the blacksmiths and the bakers.
Yeah, something like that. But Marx and Engels argued that this longing for a bygone era was a form of, well, denial. They saw industrial capitalism as a necessary stage in the development of society, a step toward a more advanced and just system. They believed that clinging to old ways of production was not only impractical, but actually held back historical progress.
So they were all about embracing the complexities of industrial society, the good and the bad.
Yes, exactly. They saw the dynamism of capitalism, its ability to create wealth and new technology, as a necessary foundation for building a communist society. Trying to go back to a simpler time, they thought, was both unrealistic and a betrayal of the historical process.
Okay, no going back. Got it. But what about those who wanted to reform capitalism, to make it fairer and more humane? What did Marx and Engels think of them?
Well, they definitely had some thoughts about that. They called this group the conservative or bourgeois socialists.
Okay.
These were people who saw the problems of capitalism, the poverty, the inequality, the exploitation, but thought the system could be fixed from within.
So instead of overthrowing the system, they just wanted to make it a little less terrible.
Right. But Marx and Engels thought this was a fundamentally flawed approach.
How so?
They considered these reformers naive and ultimately argued that they were helping to preserve the existing power structures, which benefited the bourgeoisie.
It's like putting a tiny bandage on a huge wound.
Exactly. They believed that the only way to truly solve the problems of capitalism was through a radical transformation of society, a complete overthrow of the old order. Trying to reform it from within, they argued, was doomed to fail.
So no compromise, no middle ground.
Not when it came to the core issues of class power and who controlled the means of production. They believed that any attempt to reconcile the interests of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat would ultimately betray the working class.
Wow, no mincing words there. So they critiqued the reactionary socialists, the petty bourgeois socialists, and the conservative or bourgeois socialists. Was there anyone they actually agreed with?
Well, they recognized the contributions of earlier socialist thinkers, especially those who focused on the idea of class struggle, thinkers like Saint-Simon and Fourier. Their ideas paved the way for Marx and Engels' own theories.
So they saw themselves as part of a larger intellectual tradition.
Definitely. But they also believed that their analysis went deeper, that it was more grounded in a materialist understanding of history and economics. They saw their approach as scientific because it was based on studying the real conditions of capitalism, not on wishful thinking or utopian ideals.
So they were all about evidence and facts.
Exactly. Now, there was another group that Marx and Engels had a complicated relationship with. The anarchists.
Ah, the anarchists.
Yeah.
Always stirring things up. What did they have in common with Marx and Engels, and where did they disagree?
Well, both anarchists and Marx and Engels shared a deep criticism of both capitalism and the state.
Okay.
They both agreed that those systems were inherently oppressive and needed to be abolished. But they disagreed about how to achieve that.
So same goal, different paths.
Exactly. Anarchists generally reject all forms of hierarchy and authority, including the state, even a state controlled by the working class. They want a society where people govern themselves, based on voluntary cooperation and mutual aid.
So no need for a temporary state, no dictatorship of the proletariat. Just jump straight to utopia.
Pretty much, yeah. And while Marx and Engels agreed with some anarchist critiques, they argued that the state was a tool the proletariat needed to use in their struggle against the bourgeoisie. They thought a dictatorship of the proletariat, a state run by the working class, would be needed to suppress counter-revolutionaries, to restructure the economy, and to create the conditions for a truly classless society.
So for them, the state was a necessary evil, a means to an end.